I want to welcome you to the Master Gardener Volunteer webinar. We have these monthly. My name is Wendy Wilbur. I'm the State Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator, and I'm really happy that you all have joined us today. We're nearly at about 400 people attending the webinar today, so we have a good crowd. And I put some of my favorite weeds on this slide here. With the chamber bitter, the doveweed, the crabgrass, and dollarweed. And I want to let you know that we are in our 8th webinar for 2022. And our webinar next month is with Hannah Wooten, and she's going to be talking about homeowner hydroponics. For the webinar, please limit the use of the chat box for asking questions for the speaker. You can also use the question answer box. We try not to have too many side conversations in the chat box, but if it does become distracting to you, remember that you can always minimize your chat box and not have to look at it. And I do want to remind you that the Master Gardener State Conference is coming up October 16th through 19th in Kissimmee, Florida. We do have our extended concurrent topics. I'm going to be sending this out to the whole group today, but we have 3 tracks: the food system track, the plant diagnostic track, and the Florida friendly landscaping track. So we've got some great speakers coming in. We've got Prissy Fletcher talking about artichokes. We've got Kevin Corus is going to talk about the biology of plant pathology. Adam Dale, Jarrett Daniels, and Bernie Mack are going to talk about pollinators in your home landscape. We've got Aaron Harlow talking about backyard ponds, and Stephen Brown is going to talk about Florida's wild edibles. So that's going to be a great topic. So we've got a lot of wonderful topics at the conference, and I hope that you can see that. Now, Martha says she can't see my screen. Chris, can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay, Martha, it might be hiding somewhere on your desktop. So our presenter today is Dr. Chris Marble. He's an associate professor in environmental horticulture. He's located in the Apopka Extension Center, and his main focuses are on extension and research. His research program aims to develop new methods for weed control using an integrated approach of chemical and non-chemical treatment, and really focusing on the best thing to do for the environment as well as deal with the weeds that we encounter in Florida. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and allow Chris to go ahead and start sharing now. And Chris, we welcome you. We're so glad that you're here. And we're excited that you're going to be talking to us about controlling weeds and weed ID and all things weeds. So we appreciate you being here.
Absolutely. And can you see my screen, Wendy?
I sure can. It looks good.
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in today and for the invitation to come speak. So today we'll be talking about weed control. And one thing I wanted to talk about, something that I don't typically cover with Master Gardener groups. So most of my talks to Master Gardener groups typically focus on just controlling weeds in the landscape, and we'll cover some of that today. But I've had the opportunity of going to a couple of Master Gardener plant sales, and then I work with extension agents that do the plant sales and everything. And it's like tremendous, the amount of plants, at some of these plant sales and stuff. And in terms of keeping and holding those, oftentimes it can be very difficult to control the weeds in those situations. And so I wanted to cover that and kind of talk about when you're having plant sales, holding plants, prior to transplanting them, some tips and tricks for controlling weeds in those situations. And that's primarily what my research program focuses on, is weed controlling container grown plants in terms of commercial nursery production. But we'll talk about how just weed control in general and weed biology and the impacts that has on control, and different chemical and non-chemical options, and which method is going to be most effective in different scenarios. So with that, we will go ahead and we'll get rolling if my screen will advance. So here we go. So how do weeds impact container grown plants or plants while they're in containers? Well, we know that weeds can be detrimental to plants in the landscape, just because in a lot of cases they're very competitive. If you have a 60-year-old live oak, weeds growing around the base of that are probably not going to be, competitive at all in a lot of cases, unless it was something like coconut grass, for instance, or, something that's really highly detrimental, but most landscape weeds aren't going to really cause much of an effect. But plant and you make it smaller size and you put it into a container with a restricted root volume, those plants become much more susceptible to competition from weeds. So there's been several studies. Some of these are mine, some of these other folks, but weeds in containers, they can increase water consumption, fertilizer use 10 to 20%, up to 40% in some cases. So when the weeds aren't controlled in those situations, you're basically having to water more, use more fertilizer to get the same quality of plant. And in just about all cases, weeds are going to be able to utilize those resources a lot more efficiently than landscape plants or, ornamentals, whether they're in containers or the landscape. And so keeping, those areas weed free is going to be important to the health of those plants. But they'll just reduce plant growth overall, and that's because of the water competition and fertilizer competition in space. So there's been, a study, probably the most widely cited study is that of 1972, one of the first competition studies, but one crabgrass plant reduced a holly growth by 60%, and that's just over a span of about 3 months. One eucalyptus reduced the growth of ligustrum by 58%. That's some work that my graduate student did a while back. When you're talking about in-ground plants, so when they kept weeds free around a tree that was planted into the landscape, the tree growth increased by 110%. So that just means that tree is growing faster, it's reaching maturity faster by keeping weeds free, keeping the competition down around those plants. There were several studies done with fashion azalea, eucalyptus. One plant decreased growth by 50%, prostrate spurge decreased azalea growth by 30%, and oxalis decreased the growth by 35%. So definitely different weeds are going to be more or less competitive based upon that own weed's growth habit, and then also the ligustrum or the ornamental that weed is competing with. Some faster growing ornamentals might be able to outcompete those weeds or certain weed species better than others. But just in general, a lot of these weeds can be highly competitive, especially right after transplant or when those plants are very small and just getting established. This is just another example. This is the eucalyptus competition with ornamentals. And here on this chart, this is shoot dry weight of the plant. So the boxwood, when it was weeded, is shown by the orange bars, and then when it was non-weeded is shown by the blue bars there. So, and this is just different fertilizer placements that we were looking at, because one of the things that we do is we look at how to modify production practices to basically reduce weed growth. But regardless of how we really fertilize the plants, in all cases, when those plants were weeded, those plants reached, basically a salable size and grew much more healthy, and they looked better, and they didn't have chlorosis, etc. This is a study that we just finished. This is growth of Japanese holly in a 3-gallon container. This line right here is 0% weed competition. So those plants were kept weed free through 48 weeks, so close to a whole year. And this is the growth index here. So essentially that plant is, marketable size. That's a healthy, large plant right there. These two scary lines way down here that are about half the size were subjected to either 50% or 100% weed coverage in those containers. It's also interesting to see that, even the 50%, there's not much difference between, just controlling a few of those weeds and then controlling none of those weeds. So because like I showed on that first slide, a few of those large weeds can be highly competitive and cause a lot of problems. So overview of kind of what we'll talk about. So how controlling weeds in containers might differ from the landscape and how they're similar as well. And then I'll talk about a lot of weed control methods and kind of the different things that we're working on in those situations. And these will be pretty highly applicable to a bunch of different situations. So non-chemical methods, I usually, in a non-commercial setting, I think non-chemical methods or most weeds can be controlled, very effectively, especially when you're talking about non-turf areas. with non-chemical methods, and often using things like, for example, we'll always get better control in our trials with something like mulch as opposed to pre-emergence herbicides, especially when you're carrying that out over a long period of time. We'll talk about some herbicide options and how those are similar and different based upon if you're controlling weeds in containers versus the landscape, and then developing a program where you're taking all these different things that are effective and you're combining those up to develop a program to control weeds and have kind of a plan of action for integrating different control methods together. So this is kind of how container plants and landscape plants and controlling weeds in those might differ. So when you're talking about weeds that might come into container plants that you're growing for a plant sale or something and holding those, or maybe growing them from a liner until they get to a size where you can sell them or give them away, or et cetera, you're primarily going to be dealing with weeds that are germinating from seed, because that media that you're using, typically some sort of soilless media, maybe pine bark based or peat based, et cetera. Theoretically, it's going to be weed free when it comes out of a bag or you get a shipment of it or whatever. Theoretically, it's going to be weed free if it was handled properly. And so you're not going to be dealing with things typically like nut sedge or Florida betony or torpedo grass and some of these weeds that aren't really spreading from seed. You're going to be dealing with things like spurge, sallis, bittercress, things that are germinating from seed because those seed are introduced to that media over time. Whereas in the landscape, you kind of have, you're battling everything. You have the weeds that are coming from seed, but then you also have those perennials that can come in that are spreading vegetatively through stem fragments and rhizomes and things like that, which you typically don't see in a container grown plant in most cases. In containers plants, so a lot of times the same herbicides can be used in containers and in landscape plants, but plants are going to be more sensitive in a container. They have a restricted root volume, and they're just not as established and as large as they might be in the landscape. So you have to be, much more careful and selective. Weeds are much more competitive in a container than they are in the landscape. You might see, a growth reduction of 50 to 80%, just in the span of a few months in terms of growth in a container, whereas in a landscape, those roots can expand out, and if they're getting competition from a weed, they still have room to grow, whereas they don't in a container because it's restricted. You start out with sterile media or soil, theoretically in a container, whereas in a landscape, you always have that inherent seed bank that you're dealing with. You have less herbicide options in the container, of course, than you do in a landscape. And then kind of the mantra that I tell people in a container, you start clean and you stay clean. And then the landscape, you're already dealing with probably an issue that's already there. So you want to get clean and then stay clean in terms of weed growth. But in both cases, you need to use an integrated approach. And that might be, non-chemical methods, that might be some chemical methods, or a combination of those. But you typically, to control, to get control of all the different weeds that can cause problems, you typically can't rely on just one method of control in a lot of cases. So integrated weed management. So what is kind of involved in that? And these are kind of 4 points that I try to harp on. So one is sanitation and prevention. So like I said, starting clean and staying clean. But then, in a landscape situation, a lot of times people don't take any action towards weeds until it becomes, a very big problem. And that might be, due to time or resources or whatever. But if you can manage those and do a little bit over time, you spend much less time overall managing those weeds. Hand weeding is a good example. And I'll share some data with you all today on some hand weeding trials that we've done in container nurseries at a commercial container nursery, but it's also applicable to landscape, and it's definitely applicable to when you're holding plants in a container for a plant sale or something. Also understanding how production or cultural practices are going to impact weed growth. and then also herbicide performance, using the non-chemical methods when they're applicable. And then if you're going to use herbicides, use them effectively and timely, basically choosing the best option so that you can use the lowest dose to get the best results. So sanitation and starting weed-free. So let's say that you have some containers that you're holding, or maybe you just recently potted up some liners or something that you're holding for a plant sale, and you immediately after potting, you start to see some weeds come up. So where are those weeds coming up? So maybe if they're coming up right around the base of that plant, a lot of times that's because weedy liners were used, and that might have been, you got them from a nursery or something like that where it had some liners that had some weeds in there. That's notoriously the most difficult place to control weeds is in propagation. You might just have them coming up in the middle of the pot, and a lot of times people will think, oh, the soil that I got is weed infested, and that can be the case in some instances, but people a lot of times don't realize how fast weeds can be introduced and start to germinate and grow. You have a pot that's completely that has no weed seeds in it, and in just 3 or 4 days, under the right conditions, you can start to see weed germination, and that's from nearby weeds that are germinating and spreading seed that are already landing in those pots. And in a nursery pot or in a container where you're growing an ornamental, that's an ideal environment for that plant, but it's also an ideal environment for a weed. That's usually, watered regularly, has fertilizer in it. That's a nice place for weeds to grow, and so they're going to exploit that. And then another thing to look at, so a lot of times people will reuse pots and things, and if the pots have weed seed in them, you might have weeds that are coming up around the edges, and a lot of times that can be from not cleaning those pots out properly in between uses. So if you're holding them in any kind of house or anything like that that's enclosed, keeping those areas weed-free is very important, because the weeds can be protected in those cases, just like the plants are that you're growing inside a house, and so the weeds will tend to be worse in those cases, and you might get some different species that are growing. This is kind of a worst case scenario in a commercial nursery when you have weedy liners, because there's nothing that you can do, go in and spray those. There's no herbicide that you can use. You can't even use pre-emergence herbicides in this case. Those are unrooted loropetalum cuttings. And so the only thing that you can do is pay, 10 or 12 people to go in there and hand weed all of those. And that's a lot of money. But just keeping those areas weed free, and before you have a situation like this and you have a bunch of mature weeds that are going to seed, go in there and clean those up. And there's herbicide options, and then there's also some non-chemical things that you can do to stop those weeds, having weed mats that are in good shape and things like that. So a lot of times people can reduce weed pressure just by keeping plants up off the ground on little tables and things. You have a little bit more distance between where the weeds tend to be growing and the plants, and it also will improve drainage, and so you don't get some of those species that really love to grow in those wet environments. Just another example of how weeds can grow. So putting weed-free plants that are completely weed-free on top of a table where you've got weeds all underneath the table, they will quickly, you don't see how, it does kind of defies the laws of physics, but these same species that are growing under this bench can come up and they'll start growing in those liners. And a lot of this was oxalis and bittercress, and both of those species have explosively dehiscent seed heads. So when those seed heads mature, they're going to basically explode, and they'll go somewhere between 15 and 20 feet from that mother plant. I've had a student one time that was working for me, and we were collecting seed. He got, one that popped, got into his eye, and we almost had to take him to the hospital because we couldn't get those seeds out of his eye. So we eventually, we thought we got the seed out of his eye, but 2 weeks later he had bittercress growing out of his eye, and had to go. That's not true. That was a joke, but we got it taken care of. But I'm just saying, some of these seed are explosively dehiscent, and they can spread far away from those mother plants. Plus, you've got wind and water and things like that that can spread them as well. This is another thing that I see, you know, at commercial nurseries and stuff like that a lot, but it's provides an important lesson. So a lot of times people will pre-fill pots, and that's, you know, a good way to save time in terms of potting. But you want to pot into those immediately and watch them. You don't want to just leave them sitting out there, because, you know, eventually you'll get a lot of weed seed that start to germinate and grow in those pots. And so you want to keep them clean. In this case, you know, this was several thousand pots that they had filled up, and they were going to put liners into these, but they sat for too long, and so they all had a bunch of weeds growing in there, and they had to come in and spray before they could go in and pot the plants up. So just an extra step. This is just an example of seed production. You can look and see all these tiny little bittercress and oxalis seeds and how sticky they can be. And if those dry on the edges of those pots, you know, they'll be hard to remove. But then when they're reintroduced, you know, and you reuse that pot, those seeds will continue to germinate and grow. But you can just see the pot is just completely full of seed everywhere. So recycling media. You know, people will have, maybe you have a soil pile. Hopefully it doesn't look like this, but, you know, maybe a soil pile that's been sitting out and you want to use that for plants, and that's fine. But a lot of cases, you know, you can have a lot of weeds that have landed on top of that, and whether they've germinated or not, you know, it could cause a problem eventually, where you might end up with a situation like this, where once they're potted up into containers and they were sitting, that soil pile was sitting on the ground for a long time, you start to see some of those perennial species that you typically wouldn't see in a container. But you start to see things like Florida betony, which doesn't really spread from seed. It's spreading from those rattlesnake looking tubers, those rhizomes, and then yellow nutsedge. That's another one where most of the seed is not viable and doesn't germinate, but you leave it on the ground, or you mix some filled soil in with a container grown plant, and you'll start to see things like yellow nutsedge. Then you also have things like spurge and stuff like that that are just going to come in really regardless. That's probably the most common weed there is in the Southeast, period, but you'll definitely have more of a prevalence of those. I've shared this with a lot of groups before. This is a really cool project that Sean Steed, he's a commercial horticulture agent in Hillsborough County, and he did this a while back. He got funding from the SARE program to work on some methods of weed control in nurseries. And so this is a solarization trial that he did. And basically this nursery was wanting to reuse a lot of their potting media that maybe it fell out, or it was an old container or whatever, and to save money on soil costs. But they were having a lot of weed issues doing that. So he built a system, came up with a system where basically he was, here's an example of it. So he was using clear plastic sheeting. He had 4 to 6 inches in between the two sheets. And then he had 3 to 4 inches or less of moist soil underneath that. And that's the soil that they were wanting to reuse. And they just stored that on the ground, and they, with the clear plastic, that sun was able to come in and heat it up to a really high temperature and solarize it, just like you can, you know, in a garden area as a non-chemical method of weed control. And these are some of the results that he got. So this is sterilized soil here. After 2 weeks, the temperature got up to 140 degrees, and he saw an 80 to 90% reduction in weed germination versus the non-solarized soil. The soil that they just took out of that pile and they filled up, and they had, you know, close to 100% increase in weed growth. So recycling media or reusing that old potting soil, I wouldn't really recommend it if you're trying to propagate a plant out, just because a lot of times that soil, unless you did something like solarize it, is typically going to have some weed seed in there. So something like propagation or annual or perennial plants, like you're growing a lot of butterfly plants or something like those tend to be very sensitive to herbicide. So if you were considering, you know, I'm going to use this recycled media and I can use a pre-emergence herbicide In a lot of cases, that's not an option with certain plants. You can also run into some disease issues in some cases, but it would, if you're going to use herbicides, it's important to use those pre-emergence herbicides soon after you're potting those plants up, because you're probably going to have higher weed pressure in those. Solarization is a great option, just like I talked about. Might not be feasible in a lot of cases because it does require some space and then also some time too to let it work. But it's a great, tool that you could have in your toolbox for cleaning up soils. And then there are also some things like steaming and stuff that you can do, but a lot of times that's not feasible without the large equipment. But then the best thing is just keeping the surrounding areas weed free. The sanitation practices that I was talking about earlier. So this is a really cool study. This is another one that I did with Sean Steed. And also Joe Neal and Jeff Durkee, two other weed scientists. But basically, what we did was we wanted to see how much we could reduce the time or the labor, basically based upon a hand weeding schedule. So when you have plants in containers, you're going to inevitably have to hand weed them. Even the big nurseries that are producing, multi-million dollars worth of plants every year, they have to go in and hand weed pots. They're using pre-emergence herbicides typically, but they're not going to be 100% effective because nothing is. So essentially, we wanted to look and see if we could reduce time. So we had basically 2 blocks of plants kind of set up like this, where it's about 330 or so plants. We had half of them that were weeded every 2 weeks, and then half of them were weeded every 8 weeks. But they were treated, both of these blocks were treated with herbicides in both cases. So we didn't have any that were left, non-treated. And then we reapplied the herbicides like they typically would on a nursery rotation basis. So every about 2 months, we would go back in and weed the ponds and then reapply the herbicide. In most cases, a nursery, what they would do is they pot the plant up, they go in, they would treat them soon after potting, and then before they make the second pre-emergence application, 2 to sometimes as long as 3 months after that first, they would go in and weed those pots and then make the next application, and not really do weeding in between that. And so we wanted to see if someone went in and scouted regularly and pulled those weeds, if we could reduce the cost. So here's our combined results. So if we weeded every 2 weeks, basically we reduced the weed weights by 70% reduction. And then we had a 65% reduction in weeding cost, or essentially the time that it took to weed those plants by weeding every 2 weeks versus every 8 weeks. And so why did that really happen? And it was because we didn't have any seed production. We didn't let those weeds go to seed and mature, and we controlled them before they got to that reproductive stage. And that's important whether you're using, herbicides or you're just using things like hand weeding, is to get them before they go to seed to really stop the spread of a lot of these weed species. And in the length of control as well. Joe Neal wrote an article, Frequent Hand Weeding Saves Money, but essentially we reduced the time by 65% by weeding just more frequently. So this is basically how we did it. When they were large and we knew that they would go to seed within 2 weeks, we would pull it. So this is an example of spotted spurge here, about the 4 to 6 leaf stage. And within 2 weeks, that spurge will probably start to flower. And then in 2 or 3 more weeks, depending upon the environment, it'll produce seed. And one spurge plant can produce about 8,000 seed inside of 8 weeks in Florida in the summertime. But then if they were very small, we would just leave them, because we knew that we could get them back, when we went and did our hand weeding the next time, before they went to seed. And so how did you kind of apply that? So in a container situation, do it basically like we did. We're just regularly hand weeding, and you're going in and you're weeding everything that you have within, we did, me and Sean were weeding, 1,200 containers in 10 or 15 minutes with those plots. But then when we only did it once every 2 months, when we waited till 8 weeks, it was taking us hours, and in some cases, a whole day to weed those plants when we waited that long. So really a lot of reduction in time by doing it frequently. Here's just an example of what some of those plants look like here and here. We get a lot of, in this case, there was purslane coming up at 8 weeks. Here's the 2-week interval, still completely clean versus 8-week interval, just full of weeds there. Another good example here with another herbicide that we used. All these plants were treated with the herbicide. It's just one thing that different was the more frequent hand weeding. There's an example of what we were pulling out of the pots at 2 weeks versus an 8-week interval on one block of those plants. So there's just another way to see the data there, 60 to 70% reduction in savings. This is something too that I see. So if you are going through and weeding plants, a lot of times people will leave these pots sitting, next to the plants where they don't want the weeds to grow in. But you got to be careful with that because those weeds will find a way to root down, especially if that pot gets a little bit of water on it, whether it's irrigation or rainfall, those weeds will be just as happy in that pot they've been pulled as they were in the container in some cases. So something to look out for there. But basically the take home here is just a systematic continual approach. You don't, weed control has to be kind of on a preventative basis. As soon as you get into corrective mode, that's when cost and time really increase. And the goal is to reduce the seed pressure over time. You're always going to have weeds, but you can really pressure by just staying on top of it, basically. And very little time every couple of weeks or 10 times more time, every couple of months. And so that's kind of the mantra there. Methods, I'm a big proponent of mulch. I've done a lot of research on mulches and different mulch types, done it in containers and then also in the landscape. So there's been a lot of research that's been done on mulch. Some of this is mine, some of this is others. But basically, the take home here is you can get, 50 to 100% control of just about all weeds that are important in the container. Those annual weeds growing from seed if you use mulch at an adequate depth. You can still be a problem like when they grow in the drain holes and things like that. So this is a situation where this is a large retail nursery and they were using this red mulch to control weeds, and you can look on the tops of these pots and there's really no weeds in the top of the containers, but they didn't go in and kind of weed those or stay on top of it. And so you've got weeds growing from the base of those containers and out of the drain holes. And so no method, is 100% effective. Done a lot of work with rice hulls. So rice hulls are a great option in containers, not so great in the landscape. They just don't weigh enough and they blow away. But I guess someone could theoretically use them in a landscape, maybe in a small situation or with potted plants, that were used in the landscape as decorations. But it's a great option for holding plants.
Chris, you're saying rice hulls?
Yes, rice hulls, parboiled rice hulls.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've got an example of where they can be found as well here in a couple of slides. But with the rice hull, so this is a waste product from rice production, basically. There's a big plant in Arkansas that sells it really throughout the country. But even a half an inch of rice hulls, you can use much less in a container than you would in like a typical landscape mulch that you'd want to apply at 2 to 3 inches. But rice hulls, because it's so hydrophobic, you can get away with, a half an inch and get 100% weed control. This is some work out of USDA by James Altland, and basically, 100% bittercress control with just in half of an inch. And then, a 90% reduction with just a quarter of an inch, as opposed to no mulch right here, and then the bittercress growth. This is a study that one of my postdocs did, where she was looking at mulch and then mulch and herbicides. There's still an advantage to using mulch, even if you are using herbicides. They'll typically outperform herbicides. I won't get in to too much of this chart here, just to say that this red line that's going up, that's scary and keeps exponentially going up, is no mulch. Pine bark is represented by this green line and how it increases over time. And then the rice hulls are this blue mark, and you barely see that mark. In some cases you don't, because we had 100% weed control through 11 weeks with the rice hulls. So this is kind of how it's used. You just applied it a ½ inch or so on the pot. There's several different companies that will sell rice hulls. This is kind of how someone would buy it in a commercial setting, but anybody can go on to different distributors' websites and order 50-pound sack of rice hulls, and it comes compressed like peat moss or something, and then you kind of fluff that out, and then you can just apply it to the top of the container. Relatively inexpensive. Typically the biggest expense for us in Florida is just the shipping, because a lot of times it's coming out of Arkansas or Louisiana. But there's a lot of places that will sell it, and it can be used as a potting substrate too. People have looked at it, to actually grow plants in as a component, or as a vermiculite or a perlite replacement, because it doesn't hold much water.
Chris, we've got a question on the rice hulls. Would it prevent water, do they need to water more, or is it preventing the water, or does it percolate through pretty easily? How is that working?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And a lot of times people are afraid that it will increase the water needs. But in just about all cases, what's going to happen is that water, because rice hulls are so hydrophobic, that water is going to shoot through those rice hulls really quickly. The rice hulls are going to dry out very fast, faster than a lot of other mulches. And then that's the actual substrate will stay drier. Will stay more moist for a longer period of time. So in a lot of cases, people can get by with less water when they use the mulch, just like you can in the landscape situation. So they provide a lot of benefits. There's been some other work with fertilizers and benefits that they have with leaching and things like that. But altogether, they're in a lot of cases, one of the worries that some growers will have with rice hulls and different mulches is they're going to end up leading to disease, because maybe they're not mulching all their plants, and they can't change their water schedule based upon how their wells operate or something, because they're holding a lot more water when they have the mulch on top. But yeah, you're not going to cause any detriment in terms of water use to the plant, and in most cases it saves water. So
okay, great, thank you.
Definitely an option to use herbicides in containers. But again, like I said, plants in containers are going to be more sensitive. But in containers, it's got to be all pre-emergence herbicide based. Whereas in the landscape, a lot of times people are only using post-emergence herbicides once the weeds already germinate. But in a container, really the only option that you have are pre-emergence herbicides. Post-emergence herbicides are just too, none of them are labeled. Other than the grassy herbicides, so things like Fusilade or Envoy that will control just grasses, some of those can be used, over the top of container grown plants. And they're great options for broadleaf plants in the landscapes. We had a lot of people say they hated torpedo grass. Well, if it's in a landscape bed, what you want to use is one of these graminicides, because you can't apply glyphosate over the top of those plants. You're going to kill them. But you don't have any over-the-top options, so it's got to be pre-emergence based. You can't really spot spray in a container, except for if it's a very large, pot. But you want to be preventative and integrated, and use things like the mulches and then pre-emergence herbicides when it calls for that. The biggest problem with pre-emergence herbicides, or with any pesticide in general, is calibration and not knowing how to actually apply the chemical. And I get asked all the time, what percentage do I mix this at? Well, it really depends. How much water are you using to apply it to what area? That's really the question that you have to figure out, because for something that has a broadcast rate and it tells you to apply such and such amount per 1,000 square feet, it doesn't really matter what your percent mixture is. Now, if you're just spot spraying, something that says use a 2% spray to wet, that's one thing. But for products like pre-emergent herbicides, you have to apply a known amount to a known area. But just be mindful of that and stay calibrated and know how much you're applying. And if you don't want to do that, or you don't feel comfortable with that, I would lean more toward those non-chemical options because they can be very effective. But in container grown plants, in a commercial setting there, you might use something like a belly grinder spreader like this. It basically works the same way as a rotary push spreader would, that someone would use in the landscape in a turf situation. But a lot of cases, for small plants, you might use something just like a hand shaker or something like this, which is another type of hand shaker where you can go in and apply a more controlled dose on those plants. But in those cases, you need to know how much you're applying to, the square footage of the area. Because this can happen too. If someone's not applying accurately or they're kind of pouring it out, you get really inaccurate doses, and like this side of the pot probably got about an 8 to 10x rate versus this side of the pot wasn't covered with the herbicide at all. And so that's something that you want to look out for. You should barely, in most cases, you can't tell the rate by really looking at the herbicide granulars in the pot, but you should barely, be able to see it in a lot of cases. If you start to see piles like this, you're almost using the herbicide as a mulch treatment. And these plants will probably be, well, it depends upon the species, but in a lot of cases, those ornamentals start to show injury or growth reduction over time from those higher doses. So granular products, they provide a lot of advantages. I'd say in container plants and also in the landscape, they generally have a better safety profile just because the granules will fall off the plants, and before they're activated, they're on the soil. And so you don't get as big of a chance of injury. Kind of the exception to that will be anything that kind of has whorled foliage, like maybe a liriope or Dianella or something like that, where those granules can become trapped. And in those cases, the granulars can cause, more injury in those cases. But the foliage does need to be dry with these. So you don't ever want to apply them when the foliage is wet, because they will stick on the foliage and they'll cause burning or some type of injury. And then some of them can be very dusty, and so they can create hazards. And so wearing things like respirators and stuff like that could come into play. With liquid products, the biggest advantage to those is just the cost. Liquid products are going to cost less. They're typically easier to apply. And then also they can be applied when foliage is wet. So, you have those frequent rainstorms and you want to go over the top of plants, or possibly apply them early in the morning while it's cool. The liquid products might be a good option there because it can be applied when the foliage is wet without causing injury, and just washed immediately off the plant. You have a lot of options. All of these options on this page here are pre-emergent herbicides that are labeled for use in landscapes or nurseries. And so it's basically the same group of pre-emergent herbicides. And these are all commercial versions basically, but the same actives are available. And this is color coded by mode of action. And so with a lot of these, and with a lot of the herbicides that are labeled for use in landscapes and in nurseries, as far as the pre-emergent herbicides, and this is true for turf grass and for ornamental plants in landscape beds, a lot of times they're heavily group 3 based. There's a lot of dinitroaniline herbicides. That would be things like pendimethalin and prodiamine and dithiopyr. Those will be the active ingredients that are in a lot of different products. Those are represented by the yellow color here on this graph. And so you want to be familiar with the active ingredients that you're applying, especially when you're talking about products that are marketed towards homeowners, because they'll change the name, and it might be the same active ingredient. They'll use the same name, and you're buying the same product year after year, and the active ingredient changes on you 3 or 4 times. And so you need to be mindful of what those actual active ingredients are that are listed on the label, and have an idea of what those are doing and why they are put there. And I have an EDIS article on that about homeowner herbicides and considerations, and it kind of goes through how to decipher that information and figure out, what the actual herbicides are that you're using. Because, you look at a product that's called, Weed Be Gone or whatever, that doesn't mean anything. Because there's, Weed Be Gone that has, 15 different versions of it, depending upon where you get it. So know those active ingredients that you're using, and that's just being educated about those is going to give you the best results and help you to provide the best, get the best product for your situation. But whenever you're using herbicides, pre-emergence herbicides, it's important to time them before weeds germinate. And so like when you're dealing with container grown plants, typically, you would want to apply them pretty soon after potting. You want that soil to be watered in and settled. So typically an inch or so of irrigation or rainfall, and then go in and apply the pre-emergence herbicide. And then during the season, it would really depend upon the weed pressure and the climate and how much time you can devote to those non-chemical methods or hand weeding and stuff like that. In a commercial nursery situation, it might be every 8 to 12 weeks, during the season. A lot of cases, when you're just holding a small group of plants, you can get by with a lot longer than that. You might not even need any pre-emergence herbicides. Herbicide timing, just try to avoid over-the-top applications to tender new growth. That's when plants are going to be most susceptible. And then chances of damage can increase during very warm temperatures, just like they can for turf grass. So you can't use, atrazine when temperature is above 85 degrees. A lot of these pre-emergence herbicides, they can cause injury to that tender new growth during those warm temperatures too. So that's something to be mindful of as well. This is just an example of new growth and how it was affected on this holly here. It was all burnt back from an application where the older growth was not affected at all. So that tender new growth is definitely the most susceptible part to herbicide injury. Timing, we got to be preventative if you're talking about container grown plants. If you're talking about enclosed areas, so like say you're growing plants inside of a greenhouse or some sort of completely enclosed structure, there's no herbicides that can, or at least pre-emergence herbicides that can be used in those situations. There's too much of a volatility concern, and so nothing is labeled for use in that situation. There's some post-emergence herbicides that you can use, but no pre's. And then landscapes, post herbicides, most people aren't using a lot of pre-emergence herbicides. They're basically coming back and using post-emergence herbicides. But pre-emergence herbicides can provide a benefit in either case. But the timing is a little bit different in landscape versus a container grown plant situation. You want to always rotate and develop a program. You want to program, not products. So you don't want to rely on any one product or any, even a couple of products to be your pest management. You want to have an integrated approach where you're incorporating a lot of different things. So you have a plan, but it can be flexible based upon the weather and different things like that. It's got to be based upon crop tolerance, the season and the weed species. Then you get into a lot of annual limitations with a lot of these pesticides where you can't use them, at all times throughout the year. You're maxed out at 2 or 3 applications. In a lot of cases, you shouldn't even be considering applying more than those because you get plenty of control with that. But no rotation, is going to work for everything, and so it's got to be kind of site specific. But think of herbicides as individual tools. There's no one herbicide that's going to be the best option in every scenario. So in a lot of cases, every herbicide that's commonly used, I can think of a best case scenario and a worst case scenario for using that herbicide. And this is always kind of the battle, efficacy versus safety. And with safety, in this situation, I'm talking more towards safety towards the non-target plant. So benefits of good rotations. You get better weed control, you get better tolerance of your plants, and that's true for turf grass or for ornamental plants. And then you're also reducing the chances of resistance development. This picture here was taken at a nursery that was using Soxabin, which is a very strong broadleaf pre-emergence herbicide, but it's weaker on grasses. And so they had a big bittercress issue, which is a broadleaf weed, and they just switched to Gallery and they completely controlled the bittercress, and they didn't have bittercress that ever became an issue. But then eventually that crabgrass came in, and because they weren't rotating to a different mode of action and something that was effective on crabgrass became the issue. So choosing herbicides for these different ornamentals in these cases, there's 3 steps, basically looking at the tolerance of the plants, the weeds that the herbicides will control, and then developing your program. And I just want to point you out to this manual here. If you're not familiar with it, this is a free guide. It's available online. It's the Southeast U.S. Pest Control Guide for Nursery Crops and Landscape Plantings. But it's got charts on just about every fungicide, insecticide, and herbicide that is used on ornamental plants in the southeastern United States. And we've got efficacy charts. I'll show you some examples of these, but they're really useful if you're using pesticides. In some cases, you might not have access to these products, but we have keys in there for the active ingredients that comprise each of these herbicides or fungicides or insecticides. And so you can look and you can match those up with whatever might be available to you at a big box or the retail center or whatever that you're buying those at. But this is an example of a safety chart that we have for herbicides in the weed management chapter, where we have all the different herbicides that are options, and then we have whether they're labeled. In this case, it was gardenia. So that's just an example, and it shows whether they're labeled for use in the field or the container. So basically landscape or nursery. And it just shows, all the different herbicides that can be applied over the top of gardenia there. And then you can look, for different weed species. So spotted spurs, that's usually, the #1 weed in the Southeast. So I highlighted it. And so then we rank all those pre-emergence herbicides for how effective it is on spotted spurs from good to poor. So we don't have rankings for all of them. There's a lot of gaps in the data, but that's a great resource to have when you're using pesticides. So application intervals, it's going to depend upon a lot of factors, but I'd just say frequently scouting or just inspecting it, not letting those problems get out of hand. That might eliminate the need. When you use those non-chemical options on top, and maybe when a problem gets out of hand, that's when you go for the chemical options. Like, for example, torpedo grass was one that was brought up a lot in the question. There's not a lot of great non-chemical approaches towards torpedo grass. So when that, which is an invasive grass species, comes in, that would be a good situation where a herbicide would be warranted, and something that's a post-emergent systemic herbicide, because we've done a lot of work with different mulches and things like that, and we looked at mulch controlling torpedo grass. The one thing that we found that will slow it down is 6 inches of asphalt, and that will slow it for a few weeks to months. But then after that, it can come up through the asphalt. So that's not a real data point. That's just a note on torpedo grass. But that's all I've got. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Thank you all very much for letting me speak to you today, and hope to do it again. So I'll share my screen now.
Good, Chris. When people complain to me about torpedo grass, I give them the name of a realtor. They
Right.
can just move. No, it's terrible, and it's a hard one to deal with. Would you mind sharing your screen again and going back to the book that you put up?
Sure, that's a good idea.
They'd like to see that title again, and
so there's a link. There's a link to it right there, and I think I can. Well, no, it's not going to let me copy it off of this. But if you Google, 2017 Southeast Pest Control Guide, yeah. It will come up, and it's from a North Carolina State University website. But
Mark Frank did put it in the chat box, so
okay.
slide up on up there and see that. Where do you think we could get rice hulls for the for master gardeners, or for the not for a commercial from a wholesale spot?
Yeah, so actually so if someone's like a master gardener coordinator with UF has a deal where we get discounts through several places that sell them. One is AM Leonard. I just ordered some recently from there, and it was I forgot, I ordered a bunch of it because we were doing a lot of trials with it, and I forget the cost, but it's not crazy expensive. And it's light and easy to deal with. You buy a 50 pound, big bale, and that will do, a ton of plants, because rice hulls weigh very little, and they're compacted down. You kind of fluff it up, but there's several places where you can find it. You can order it from that Parboiled Rice Hulls, Riceland Products. That's one of the big manufacturers, and they have on their website a list of distributors that have those available in different locations. So that's just a couple places that produce it. Riceland Products is probably the biggest one that does, that has the most distributors that are selling it. So,
well, most of our group is familiar with AM Leonard, and I think that's a really good lead, so they can start there. And I also did go on Amazon real quick and notice that they had it as well. So
right.
Maybe we'll begin to see that a little bit more. Without going too far from the rice hulls, somebody said that they had purchased a plant that was more rice hulls than potting media, and then that plant passed away. So I'm not surprised about that.
Yeah.
And then I was excited when I see rice hulls in a nursery, I feel like that person is really kind of taking really good care of their plants and making sure that weeds are not coming home to my house, which I really appreciate. And then it just seems to disappear in my landscape. So that's good.
Right.
David D'Ambrosio is wondering, is it all right when weeding your garden to just leave the weeds to decompose?
Oh, if they're already in, seeding, probably not the best idea. To be honest with you, that's how I do it in my house. I'm not gonna take the time, because I'm just going through and pulling them, and I'll just leave them right where they're sitting. That's probably not the best idea. But if they're not going to seed, and they don't have a lot of seed on there, and you can tell, by the maturity and the size, it's not going to. It's just organic matter, so they're not going to go to seed, after you pull them. There's a few things that, like, for example, dayflower. Like, you pull that up and throw it on like a mulch bed or something, and it rains within 3 or 4 days, it'll root back down. It's tenacious. Same thing with like torpedo grass, but most of them, spurge, all those things. If they're not in seed, I'll just take them and just leave them where they're at. It's just organic matter, that you're adding back. So
right. Somebody mentioned, and she just wanted to kind of reiterate what you said about the most important takeaway was that, weed control is not a product, it's a program.
right.
And I think that, if we remember anything else from today, that is probably the most important thing. There are folks in the chat box saying, what's the best, most effective and cheapest herbicide? It depends, do you want to speak to that a little bit, Chris?
Absolutely, yeah. So I always say, yeah, it's not a product, and that's the first thing people go towards. And stuff that I'm not an expert in, I'm going to say or I go to the doctor, what's the best medicine or whatever. But when somebody doesn't say it depends, a lot of times you're talking to a salesman in a lot of cases. Nothing wrong with that. But it always depends upon the situation. Like I said, with herbicides and with any pesticide in general, I can come up with a scenario where just about any herbicide might be, your best or only option, and then another scenario where it could be an absolute detrimental nightmare. And so, I do a lot of rotations for nurseries, and I'll put, examples into talks, whether it's for a landscape or a nursery. And people say, why don't you just publish or, come out? And I've had offers to come out with just like a rotation that everybody could use and adopt. And you can't do that because what works for, nursery A might kill everything at nursery B's location. So you've got to incorporate, all these different things, and no one herbicide is going to control the weeds, and no one herbicide is going to be, safe for all the plants. So
good. And what about someone's asking about polymeric sand to suppress weeds coming up through pavers, and then another person is asking about blow torching to deal with pavers.
Yeah, blow torching. I haven't seen anything as far as data goes on the sand, but I mean anything to where there's not space for those weeds to germinate and grow is going to help. So like if there's a soil and things like that that's settled in between. The blowtorch, that's a tremendously fun way to control weeds, and pavers is a great place to use that. They work, I kind of say that the blowtorching or the flaming weeds, it's very similar to how a contact herbicide works. A lot of times for large weeds, you're not going to get to the root or any underground storage organs of that plant. But in most cases, when they're coming in pavers or driveways and stuff like that, they're small annual weeds anyways. And so a lot of cases you can get, 100% control just by burning the tops. So.
Okay, good. Pat Marciano said she weeds for probably like a community garden or an organization which uses herbicides on their hardscape. What time frame do I need to pass to avoid exposure?
For the herbicide on so it would, I mean, the label will give you a time frame. So it's not like in agriculture, we have what's called a restricted entry interval. And so that means that no one can come into these treated areas within that restricted entry interval unless they're wearing the proper PPE. In a landscape situation, most of the time, it'll just say, keep off until dry. So, in landscapes or things like that, you don't have to follow the same or, the restricted entry interval as you do in the agricultural situations where it's more regulated. But I would just say, I mean, you could follow that restricted entry interval and keep people out of that area for that amount of time, and that would be a safe way to go about it. Or, doing things like treating after hours and things like that when there's not as many people coming through. You don't want to be, even if, people aren't really in the area, you don't want to be treating when other people are there, if possible, just because of drift and things like that. So.
And for all master gardeners, if you are, want to learn more about the chemicals that have been applied, ask for the label and material safety data sheets. That's well within your right, and then follow the recommendations there. We don't want you to be exposed unnecessarily. So if you don't have that information and you don't want to volunteer there, then don't until you get that information in hand and figure out what's going on there. Okay.
Yeah.
And then about the steam cleaning, not steam cleaning, that's my house, the steaming of potting soil. And some folks were saying, can I bake it in the oven? Is there a home method? And then another question about the solarization, doesn't that also knock back the beneficial insects and fungi and microorganisms, et cetera?
Oh, I mean, I guess you could bake it. I don't know how feasible that would be. But I mean, yeah, you're just basically heating up that soil. As far as the potting media goes, I mean, you're not, I mean, like in a landscape situation, you might be, harming the, I guess, beneficial bacteria and fungi and stuff like that. There's not really that much that's going on, or, I don't think you're going to have too much of an effect on the container media, which is soilless. As you would like in a landscape situation. But typically, from a solarization standpoint, those species, there's been some work that shows, they're looking at soil microorganisms and then respiration rates over time and looking at the populations and stuff like that. That's definitely outside of my area of expertise, but typically they recover so quickly that it's not really a significant impact for something like a solarization or steaming or something like that. So, and then I forgot what the other question was. Oh, as far as home methods and things?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as like large batches, I mean, just putting it on something and drying it out and heating it up is, I think any of that will work. You just want to be able to, have good sunlight exposure and clear plastic so that you get that temperature up. And I think most of the research has shown somewhere between 130 to 140 degrees is typically needed for, a lot of these pests and things to get control. I'd have to go back and double check that, but there'd be a lot of different ways that you could solarize things just with plastic and, having exposed. The key would be like if you put it into a garbage can bin or something like that, you would want to keep that, be able to spread that soil out so that you don't have a big deep volume, because it's not going to heat up, all the way through the bottom of that. You'd want to be able to keep the soil layer thin. Like when Sean did his work, they spread it out, I think 3 or 4 inches so that they'd be able to heat it up. So.
Yeah. Okay. I've got 2 last questions and then we're going to let you go because we know you're busy. And you can do it either way. One is on the use of vinegar for weed control, and the other is cleaning and sanitizing those pots to knock down weed seeds that we might be bringing into our nursery stock.
Okay, so I'll do the cleaning it for weed seeds. So as far as cleaning the pots for things like pathogens and stuff like that is completely different. In a lot of cases, you might need to use like a diluted bleach or something. For weed seeds, a lot of times all you need is some pressurized water. So jet stream on a hose, and you're going to remove most of everything there. And then as far as vinegar for weed control, acetic acid, which is it's the active ingredient vinegar. It acts like a desiccant. So you're basically, destroying the cell membrane of those plants and they're drying out. It is effective. Household vinegar, which is typically like a 5% vinegar, is generally not as effective as like a horticultural vinegar that's like 20%. And I also don't recommend, I mean, it's not going to really hurt much to go out and spray, apple cider vinegar on plants and things. But I tell people if you're going to use it as a consistent weed control method, it's better to use one of the things that are labeled for use as a herbicide, because one, they'll typically put a surfactant in there where you get improved results, but then it also has safety information on there in terms of how to use it safely. Because like a 20% acetic acid product is pretty caustic to your skin and eyes and things like that, and they typically have warning labels. And so you need to wear eye protection and gloves and things like that, and not get that on your skin. When we use it, we use respirators because we're usually treating a lot of it. But it's a great weed control tool, a non-chemical method, and it'll burn the tops back. Very effective on annuals, small annual weeds. Perennials, it typically isn't as effective, and they'll come back from it.
Good. In a former life, I worked in a laboratory, and for the 20% acetic acid that we used it in the hood. It's a serious chemical, so we have to be careful with that.
And I don't say that to deter people from using it. I just, people think of vinegar as being harmless, or that they put it on, it's food. It's just different. A horticultural vinegar is much different than the vinegar that you buy to cook with. So that's just the point that I try to make.
Very good. Well, everyone, I want to remind you that we'll have this recording up in about 2 weeks. So if you want to rewatch it or share with friends, there's going to be that'll be available on the Master Gardener Volunteer website. And so you can access that at that time. So Chris Marble, thank you so much. Everyone really enjoyed the information. We learned so much today that was so useful, and we really, really appreciate it. Thank
Absolutely.
you. Lots of wonderful comments about how organized and how useful the information is, and how great the presentation was. So we do appreciate it, and thank you so much.
Oh, very much. I appreciate the invitation.
All right, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.